The man on the bench was wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap and a thin flannel shirt, and the particular expression of someone who has long since stopped expecting anything from the weather. Snow had been falling on Grayson, Colorado since 6 that morning. It was now past noon. The flannel shirt had a small American flag patch sewn above the left pocket, and the man wearing it had his arms crossed and his chin down and his eyes on the middle distance in the way that men look when they are managing something the body is telling them about cold. Nobody on the sidewalk stopped. Nobody slowed. Nobody looked. A dog stopped. He pressed his muzzle against the man's knee without being told. That was the moment Nathan Cole saw him, not the man first, the dog first. Because that was always how it worked, and because in 7 years of working beside Diesel, Nathan had learned to read the dog's body the way most men read a face. Diesel's nose was down, and his tail was still, and his weight was forward, which meant what it always meant. Someone here needs attention. Nathan had stopped arguing with that signal the second year. What he saw when he looked past the dog would stay with him for a long time. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and follow it until the very end. What you're about to hear is the kind of story that changes how you see the man on the next bench. We read every single comment. Staff Sergeant Nathan Cole, USMC, retired, was 39 years old, and he wore 39 the way good tools wear their age, honestly, with marks that meant something. He was 6 feet and 205 pounds, built for endurance rather than display, with dark hair cut short at the sides and a face that had been shaped by years of direct sun and concentrated attention into something angular and settled. His jaw was squared and his nose had a low bridge that made his face look broader than it was, and his eyes were a steady, pale blue-gray that people either found reassuring or unsettling depending on which side of something they were standing on. The kind of eyes that took in a room in one pass and held it without needing to look again, that registered everything without any of it being visible on the surface. He was not a man who broadcast his thinking. He was a man whose thinking had consequences. He'd done 3 tours, 2 with the 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines in Helmand Province between 2009 and 2012, and a 3rd as part of a special-purpose Marine Air-Ground Task Force in eastern Syria in 2015 that he did not discuss in detail and was not required to. He'd come home from the last tour on a medical separation after a training accident at Camp Pendleton, tore the ACL in his right knee, and compressed the L4 disc badly enough that the surgeons told him the Marine Corps was no longer a viable long-term plan. He had accepted this the way he accepted most things, without visible complaint, and with a private grief that he kept compressed and organized in a part of himself that he did not open for inspection. For the past 3 years, he'd been living in Grayson, Colorado, doing security risk assessments for a regional bank consortium and coaching wrestling at the high school on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, which he did not advertise but which had, in 2 seasons, produced a state qualifier. He was not looking for credit. He was looking for something to do with the particular kind of energy that did not discharge cleanly in civilian life. He had Diesel. Diesel was a 7-year-old German Shepherd, with a coat the color of dark mahogany and charcoal, dense through the shoulders and lighter along the belly, with amber eyes that operated in a register of constant attentiveness that most people found startling when they first encountered it. Not aggressive. Simply present in a way that suggested no detail was going to escape without notice. He weighed 91 pounds, all of it working weight, with a gait that covered ground quietly, and a habit of moving in whatever direction Nathan's body was moving a half-second before Nathan moved, as if he read the decision before it was made. His right ear had been torn partially at the base during an explosive breaching operation in Sangin in 2014. A blast that had also knocked Nathan off his feet and left him with tinnitus in his left ear for 6 months. And the scar had thickened into a ridge of tissue that gave the ear a slightly different set than the left, permanent and exact, like a mark of longitude on a map. He had retired from the military working dog program 8 months before Nathan had. And Nathan had submitted the adoption paperwork 24 hours after he was discharged. Diesel had been in the passenger seat of Nathan's truck the following Thursday and had not left it voluntarily since. Grayson, Colorado sat at the base of the San Juan Mountains in a long valley where the altitude made January feel like a different category of season than anywhere else Nathan had lived. The town had a main street with a pharmacy and a hardware store and a diner called the Front Range that opened at 5:30 in the morning for the ranchers and closed at 3 in the afternoon when the ranchers were back at work. And a Korean War memorial in the small park across from the post office that nobody ever vandalized because the people of Grayson had a long memory for what the names on it meant. The snow that January was the kind that fell without drama, steady, fine-grained, accumulating in layers that compacted under their own weight. The bench where the old man sat was on the east side of Main Street, outside a closed shoe repair shop, sheltered slightly by an awning that had done its best work in a different decade. The man's name was Frank Colton. He was 77 years old. He had been a specialist in the United States Army, 1st Cavalry Division, Airmobile, and he had done 2 tours in Vietnam between 1966 and 1968. And he had been in the Ia Drang Valley in November of 1965, which was not a thing Nathan knew yet when he sat down beside him, and which, when he learned it, would put a different frame around everything he thought he understood about the man in the thin flannel shirt on the bench in the snow. Frank had been sleeping in the storeroom behind the Grayson Feed and Ranch Supply for 11 days. The owner, a man named Gil Bauer, had come in one morning to find Frank asleep on a horse blanket between 2 pallets of fence posts, and had made the quiet calculation that a man who needed a horse blanket for a bed in January had already been through enough judgment for one lifetime, and had left him a thermos of coffee and gone back to running his store without asking for an explanation. That had been Gil's decision to make, and he had made it with the particular grace of a man who had stopped waiting for someone else to do the right thing. But a storeroom with no heat in January in the San Juan Mountains was not a solution, and Gil had been trying to figure out for 11 days what the solution was when Nathan sat down on the bench outside his store, and Diesel pressed his muzzle against Frank Colton's knee. Nathan took his jacket off and put it around Frank's shoulders without asking. It was a heavy canvas work jacket lined with fleece, the kind that did what it was supposed to do, and Frank's hands came up and held the lapels closed with the automatic reflex of a man whose body had been waiting for something warm and had not believed it was coming. He didn't say thank you. He looked at the dog. "What's he want?" Frank said. "He wants to know you're all right," Nathan said. A long pause. Diesel had not moved from Frank's knee. "He can see that's a stretch," Frank said. "Yeah," Nathan said. "He can." He did not ask what had happened or how long or where Frank had been sleeping. He asked whether Frank had eaten that day. When Frank said he'd had a donut from the gas station at 7, Nathan stood and asked him to come to the Front Range. And when Frank looked uncertain, Nathan picked up Diesel's leash and said the dog needed feeding too, which was not entirely true. And Frank stood because it gave him a reason that wasn't charity. Inside the Front Range, the warmth hit them like a physical thing. It smelled like coffee and eggs and the particular smell of a diner that has been cooking the same food for 30 years, grease and flour, and something beneath those that was simply warmth accumulated over decades and absorbed into the walls. A woman named Ruth Ann worked the counter on the morning shift and had worked it for 19 years and was not a person who required explanation before pouring coffee, which she did for Frank before he had fully taken off his coat. They sat in a corner booth, and Diesel lay under the table against Frank's feet, and Nathan listened. The story came out the way these stories do from men of a certain generation, not as complaint, never as complaint, but as a flat recitation of facts that, assembled, added up to something no decent person could hear without feeling the particular anger that lives just below grief. Frank had been in Grayson for 4 months. He'd come from Pueblo, where he'd been living in a rooming house on a fixed income that had covered the rent until the building was sold, and the new owners doubled it, and Frank's portion of the math no longer worked. He had a daughter in Phoenix he had not called, because the last time he had called she had told him, in a voice he had never been able to fully forget, that she had her own problems and couldn't take on any more. He had a VA benefits claim that had been filed 14 months ago and was still pending, which was the particular cruelty of a bureaucracy that processes things at its own speed without regard for the speed at which a 77-year-old man in a thin flannel shirt exhausts his options. He had his discharge papers, his DD-214, folded in a waterproof sleeve inside his jacket, because there were things a man held onto, and that was the thing Frank Colton held onto. He had not been on the bench to ask for help. He had been on the bench because it was close to the library, which was warm and open until 5, and he had been pacing his warmth in 2-hour increments. Nathan listened to all of it without interrupting. He ate his eggs. He refilled Frank's coffee twice, meaning he pushed the mug toward Ruth Ann's end of the counter twice, and she came and filled it without being asked, because Ruth Ann Briggs had been born in Grayson and knew what looking at someone meant. When Frank finished, Nathan asked one question. "The VA claim. Do you have the case number?" Frank reached inside the flannel shirt and produced the waterproof sleeve and extracted a folded sheet from the back of it. He had the number. Nathan took a photograph of it with his phone. He did not explain what he planned to do with it. He paid for the food, told Frank he was going to make some calls, and asked Frank to stay warm. He left the jacket with Frank when he left. The rest of that day and the 2 that followed were not dramatic in the visible sense. They were the kind of work that happens in phone calls and emails, and the particular leverage that comes from knowing exactly who to call and what to say when they pick up. Nathan called a man named Gideon Marsh, a veteran service officer he had worked with twice before on benefits cases, and gave him the claim number and Frank's name and a brief description of the timeline. Gideon said 14 months for a combat veterans benefits claim was unconscionable. And he'd said so before, and he'd say so again, and he'd escalate it today. Nathan called the Grayson VFW post, which had a commander named Dorothy Vallis, who had been running it for 11 years, and who had a spreadsheet of emergency housing resources that she kept current and used often. Dorothy said she'd have something by morning. What Nathan did not call, did not plan, and did not expect was what happened on the 3rd day. Because he did not know, could not have known, that a man named Richard Alderman had been eating breakfast at the table beside theirs on the morning Nathan had walked Frank Colton into the Front Range. Richard Alderman was 63 years old and had been a brigadier general in the United States Army before he retired to Grayson 4 years ago to run a small cattle operation with his wife and finish the book he'd been meaning to write for 20 years. He was a quiet man in civilian life, which people who had known him in uniform found surprising, and people who had known him in Grayson found completely consistent. He had been eating his eggs and reading the Durango Herald, and he had watched Nathan take off his jacket in the snow, and then had followed them inside at a distance, and had sat at the adjacent table and had heard, without trying to, the shape of the conversation. He had not introduced himself. He had finished his coffee and left. On the morning of the third day, Nathan's phone rang at 07:15. The number had a Washington, D.C. area code, which he almost didn't answer. He answered it. "Staff Sergeant Cole," the voice said. "This is Brigadier General Richard Alderman, retired. I believe you sat next to me at the Front Range on Tuesday." Nathan was quiet for a moment. "I had some calls to make," the general said. "I hope that's all right." It was more than all right, though Nathan would not fully understand what it meant until the following morning, when Gideon Marsh called to tell him that Frank Colton's VA benefits claim had been expedited through a priority processing track reserved for cases flagged by a flag officer with documentation of extended delay, and that a determination of full benefits with back pay covering 14 months of arrears was being processed immediately. The back pay figure, when Gideon read it, was $19,600. The general had also called a man at the Colorado Department of Veterans Affairs, and that man had called a woman who oversaw emergency veteran housing placement, and by the time all of those calls were done, there was a furnished apartment in Grayson, a real apartment, with a kitchen and a heater that worked, waiting for Frank Colton, with the first 3 months covered by an emergency veterans fund that the state had maintained for years for precisely this purpose and used far less often than it should have. Nathan drove to the library to find Frank. He found him at a table near the window with a book open in front of him that he was not reading, because the book was open to a page he'd been on for 40 minutes. Diesel walked to the table and sat beside Frank's chair and put his head on the armrest, and Frank's hand came down onto the dog's ruff without looking. "Something's happened," Nathan said. He sat across from Frank and put his phone on the table between them and told him all of it, plainly and completely. He watched Frank's face while he talked. He watched it do a series of things that Frank was trying not to let it do, and then stop trying. And then Frank Colton, who had been in the Iadrong Valley and had survived things that would appear in history books, put his face in both hands and stayed there for a long moment, while Diesel pressed his weight gently against Frank's leg and did not move. Nobody in the library spoke. 2 women at the reference desk looked over and then looked at each other and looked away and gave the moment what it needed, which was space. Richard Alderman met Frank Colton for the first time the following Saturday at the Front Range, at a corner booth, with Ruth Ann filling the coffee before anyone asked. He introduced himself by his first name only, which was the kind of decision that told Nathan everything he needed to know about the general. He had brought a folder that contained, among other things, the name of a VSO who would help Frank navigate the back pay process, and a contact at the Grayson VA clinic who had agreed to get Frank's medical records transferred, and a first appointment scheduled within the week. He had also brought, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, a new flannel shirt, heavy cotton, lined, the kind built for Colorado winters, which he set on the bench beside Frank without comment. Frank looked at it for a moment. He looked at Alderman. "You didn't have to do all this," Frank said. "I know," Alderman said. Diesel, under the table, turned one slow circle and lay down between them with his chin on his forepaws and his tail making 2 slow arcs across the linoleum floor. 4 months later, the April sun came down into the San Juan Valley like it meant to stay, and Frank Colton was living in the apartment on Birch Street with a coffee maker and a window that faced the mountains and a copy of Shelby Futates' Civil War trilogy on the shelf that the housing coordinator had left, because she figured a man who'd read his way through the library deserved something to take home. His VA benefits were current. His back pay had settled the small debts he'd accumulated over the 14 months the claim had been pending and left him enough to eat without calculating. He walked to the Front Range most mornings, and Ruthann poured his coffee before he sat down. The man who had led the effort to expedite his claim, a mid-level VA administrator named Parker Hendricks, who had been sitting on the file for 9 months without action, while Frank Colton paced his warmth in 2-hour increments, was the subject of a formal review initiated by General Alderman's complaint. The review found a pattern of delayed processing on 42 claims with similar profiles. Hendricks was removed from his position in March, and the 42 claims were reassigned for immediate processing. Nathan didn't know all of that until Gideon Marsh mentioned it in passing on the phone one morning. The way you mentioned something that turned out to be larger than expected, but that started the way things sometimes start, with a dog pressing its nose against an old man's knee in the snow. Nathan had his jacket back. Frank had returned it the week of the apartment, folded and clean, with a note tucked inside the breast pocket that said, in the careful, unsteady handwriting of a man who did not write many notes, Ia Drang, November 1965. I made it home. So did this. Thank you. Nathan kept the note in the breast pocket. He did not take it out often. He did not need to. Sometimes miracles don't announce themselves at all. Sometimes they happen in the space between a dog pressing its muzzle against a cold knee and a man choosing, without drama and without an audience, to take off his coat. God does not reserve his movement for the grand gesture, the thunderclap, the moment the whole world is watching. He works in the ordinary Tuesday, in the diner booth, in the phone call from a general who ate his eggs quietly and didn't say a word while something important was happening at the next table. Frank Colton had served his country in one of its hardest hours and had come home to 60 years of life and had ended up on a bench in the snow, and not a single soul on that sidewalk had stopped. Until a dog stopped. Because dogs do not have the part of us that convinces itself this is not our business. Sometimes all that stands between a man and the cold is whether someone next to him is paying the kind of attention the world needs more of. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that paying attention is itself an act of courage. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And if you've ever passed someone and then turned back, we want to hear about that moment. Your story might be the one that moves someone else to turn back too. If you believe in stories of service, faithfulness, and the quiet heroism of ordinary people who haven't stopped caring, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, and keep your eyes open for the man on the bench shirt who is not asking, because those are the ones who need it most. You are never alone, and neither is he.